welcome. My name is Dmitry Grozbinski. I'm the Executive Director of the Geneva Trade Platform, and it's my pleasure to present this session to you. This session is part of our Geneva Trade Week, where we try to supplement and improve the experience of anyone following along with the WTO's public forum. And this particular session is a look at a book released in March by the World Bank, and we are very privileged to have with us all three authors of that book and the reports that went into it, as well as our discussant. We have with us Paul Brenton, Michael Ferrantino, and Maryla Maliszewska, all of which contributed to the report. And we have our very own Professor Richard Baldwin to discuss it. The report is called Reshaping Global Value Chains for COVID-19, Implications for Trade and Poverty Reduction in Developing Countries. I understand it was to be presented at the WTO Public Forum, but the global value chain of economists traveling to Geneva broke down. And so we are happy to step in and offer a virtual platform in order to share what we hope are really important insights. The structure for our session today will begin with a pitch for the book by Paul, followed by presentations of the text by Maryla and Paul, then some reflections from Professor Baldwin, drawing on some of his recent articles, research, as well as his sort of thinking on where global value chains might be going. And finally, we will take your questions, ably moderated by our own Michael Ferrantino. If you want to, you can begin to ask your questions at any time. All you have to do is pop them into that Q&A box at the bottom. And Michael can select from among them, put them to our panel, deal with them himself. We will be in his capable hands. So with no further ado than that, except to thank our wonderful team that helped us put this together, as well as the Australian government, the Geneva Chamber of Commerce, and the Graduate Institute that made Geneva Trade Week possible, allow me to hand us over to Paul. This is, I think, an important book, but it is a fairly long one. So what is in it, and why should someone wade through it?
Thanks very much, Dimitri, and thanks to you and your team for this opportunity. Well, in terms of length, there are many more World Bank books that are longer than this. So I think in terms of length, don't get put off. I think we're pretty succinct compared to the usual World Bank tome. Why did we do this? Why did we look at this issue of global value chains and how they might be impacted by COVID? I think the bottom line is the subtitle, which is, what does it mean for developing countries? Because global value chains, as we'll discuss, have been a very important driver of trade and poverty reduction in developing countries. And we've seen huge impacts in particularly East Asia, and what being able to participate in the global economy means for poor people in countries like China, etc. But there are still many countries that have not yet fully benefited or been able to integrate into the global economy. So one of the issues we wanted to look at is whether the impact of COVID and other factors that are sort of reshaping the global economy, whether that still means that trade remains a vehicle for poverty reduction for those countries, particularly countries in Africa, for example. And I'll spoil the story. Yes, trade, it can and must be an important driver of growth and poverty reduction in Africa. So it's vitally important that trade and particularly global value chains remain open and accessible to those countries that have yet to benefit from globalization. Having said that, COVID has been a major shock to the global economy. It's had profound implications for trade and for global value chains, and we need to rethink how we assist developing countries in being able to leverage the opportunities from global value chains. What we've seen from the recent past is that not all countries have benefited from being able to access trade, and why is that, and what can we do to assist them? Not everyone within countries has benefited from trade and global value chains. So the distributional implications of trade are very important. We're learning more about that all the time, and more of what we can do to address that, to make sure that those who lose from trade or who are not able to benefit from trade are assisted so that they do not lose, and the benefits of trade are shared equally. We're also seeing, in addition to COVID, increasing challenges to the global economy, increasing sources of shocks, in particular climate change, and that's something that Maryla is going to talk about a little bit, and also increasing geopolitical tensions, as we've seen with the war in Ukraine. So it's a time when the global economy is facing very severe challenges, but at the same time, for many of our clients in the World Bank, trade remains a vital driver of growth and for delivering new opportunities for poor people in those countries. So it's not too long. It's very cheap. In fact, it's free to download. So please go to our website and take a look. If length is a problem, there is a very nice executive summary, which is about 4 pages long, which is what I think 99% of people read. So I think with that, perhaps we can turn to the presentation and sort of try and reinforce some of those points that were just made.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul.
Great. So there's the cover. That's what it looks like. If we can go to the first slide, I think it'll explain a little bit of what we're trying to achieve, and the layout of today's presentation. Maybe it's a little bit of a delay in when I'm getting the what's on screen, but I'll continue in the meantime. Perhaps it's prescient just to start with, what do we mean by global value chains, and why are they important? And a global value chain arises when production of a product or a good or a service which was previously concentrated in one location is split up into a series of different activities or tasks. And those different activities and tasks take place in different locations around the world. That's been a key feature of the development of the global economy over the last 30 years. And it's important for development because that's enabled developing countries to participate in trade in ways that weren't available beforehand. When it was necessary to undertake all of the activities, or the majority of activities in a value chain, it was very difficult for developing countries, particularly small developing countries, to develop export capabilities. But when that activity has been broken down into the different tasks, it's been much easier for developing countries to develop capacities in some of those activities and participate in global trade. So a global value chain arises, for example, and very simply, when the sort of intermediate inputs, let's say textiles, are made in one country, shipped to another country, where they're then made up into clothing, and then shipped to a final country for consumption. That's the simplest possible global value chain, if you like. But most value chains are far, far more sophisticated than that, and some involve parts and components, multiple parts and components moving around all over around the world in quite a sophisticated way. And these complex networks are what have come to sort of dominate trade in a lot of sectors. So GVCs have been an opportunity for developing countries to participate in trade. And so we're going to look at, then why that matters very quickly again. Look at what was the impact of COVID-19 on global value chains, because this was the biggest shock to trade, at least since 2000, and the big crisis in 2002, 2008, 2009, but also one of the biggest shocks since the Second World War. And what was the impact of that shock on global value chains, and how have they recovered from that shock, and what are the lessons from that for developing countries that want to leverage trade more effectively for development? And then I'm going to pass on to Maryla, who's going to look at some of these other longer term trends that are shaping trade and global value chains, in particular the geopolitical issues, increasing protectionism, the new technologies that are shaping production and trade, and then climate change adaptation and mitigation. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll just start, and the one after that. I think this slide summarizes pretty well why we're interested in GVCs. What the red line shows is how the share of developing countries in global trade increased over the last 3 decades. And that share almost doubled from around just over 15% to around 30%. And that, global value chains were one of the key drivers of that increasing participation in global trade. And it's no coincidence that over the same period, the number of people in extreme poverty declined rapidly. And that's shown by the blue solid line, with the number of extreme poor falling from over 35% to less than 10% of the global population. And a great deal of that poverty reduction occurred in China and other Asian countries, but not limited to those countries. And although there are obviously multiple factors and multiple issues going on here that explain these trends, it's very difficult to envisage this extent of poverty reduction without the increasing participation of developing countries in global trade. So that's why we really are concerned, interested in trade and GVCs, because of their role in poverty reduction. And as I said, one of the issues for this book is, can global value chains continue to play that role as a driver of poverty reduction in a world of shocks such as COVID and increasingly frequent shocks, from climate change and geopolitical tensions, etc. But let's just move on and let's just look at what was the impact of COVID on trade and global value chains. If we can go to the next slide, please, and the one after that. So the top slide here is just showing the extent of the COVID shock, which is the sort of the bars below the line. And you can see 2 recent big episodes of negative shocks, the 2008-2009 crisis and the COVID shock in 2020. I think it's green bar, it shows the change in trade, and the blue bar, the change in real GDP. And we can see very significant shocks, both to trade and to GDP. One interesting feature there is that the trade shock with COVID was slightly less intense than the trade shock in 2008-2009, but the impact on GDP was much higher. The COVID shock had a much bigger impact on GDP than did the 2009 financial crisis. And if you look at the ratio of the trade shock to the GDP shock was about just over 2 to 1 under COVID. It was 5 to 1 in the previous shock. So something different happened in this shock than the previous shock. And one of the main explanations is that the COVID shock hit services much more heavily than it did in the previous shock, and more heavily in many ways than it hit goods. And you can see that a little bit in the figure below, which shows the monthly changes in exports and imports of goods and services. And the key thing there is that just after that vertical line is the impact of COVID in January 2020, a massive negative fall, massive fall in exports and imports of goods and services, but a much quicker recovery in goods trade. And actual fact, you can see that recovery was much quicker and more substantial than the recovery from the 2008-2009 crisis, and that was particularly driven by goods, trading goods, and less so than trade and services. You can see that there's been a bit of a catch-up now in recent months in services, but you can also see that there was a period of a quite extreme overheating, if you like, in goods trade in the middle of 2021. And you can see that if you go back up to the top graph, in terms of what's been happening with overall trade and GDP. A very, very strong rebound in 2021 and slightly cooling off now in 2022. So I think the key message from here was that there was a very big negative shock to trade, both goods and services, but quite a rapid rebound, and particularly for goods. Services were affected more negatively than goods trade. So if we can go to the next slide, please. This shows that the trade in a number of sectors which are typically treated or thought of as being dominated by global value chains, particularly electronics and electrical goods. Think of the iPad, which has parts and components from all over the world before it's assembled and then sent to, say, the US or the European markets. And these sectors that are dominated by global value chains were hit very hard at the beginning of the crisis. And you can see all of the sectors here, bar one, which I'll get to, saw quite a significant decline in trade, but they recovered pretty quickly. The one exception, of course, is the sector providing medical equipment, which saw a big increase in trade in the crisis. Now, one of the reasons, one of the issues is that trade and global value chains do transmit shocks around the world. One of the issues that people raise about global value chains is that they can be a shock transmitter. So the initial shock in China when there was a shutdown early in 2020, that was transmitted around the world because there was a big decline in the supply of intermediate inputs that were essential in inputs in other activities around the world. On the other hand, trade offsets can be a powerful offsetter of domestic shocks. So, when COVID led to lockdowns in some countries, activities related to trade could continue because demand was still available in other countries which hadn't yet shut down. And then finally, global value chains have been, while they're a transmitter of the initial negative impacts of a shock, they're a very powerful transmitter of recovery and for positive shocks around the world. And we've seen that very much in 2020, 2021, where trade has shifted or spread the recovery widely around the globe. And there are reasons why global value chains may be a more resilient part of trade than other types of trade which is more direct, minerals and products which don't require much transformation. And if we can go to the next slide, the top slide has two lines, and what that does, it decomposes trade into two types, what we call the intensive margin and the extensive margin. The intensive margin is essentially changes in existing trade flows, changes in the volume of trade flows that continue, whereas the extensive margin is the changes due to the disappearance, the closing down or the reopening of trade flows. And what we see at the global level, that in the COVID, under the COVID shock, most of the adjustment in trade took place at the intensive margin, which means it was primarily through changes in the volume of trade flows rather than changes in the number of trade flows. So that suggests that there were reasons to keep trade flows, to keep trade relations continuing during COVID. And that's because changing suppliers, shutting down suppliers, and then finding new suppliers is costly. And there are reasons why lead firms within a global value chain will take actions to maintain supplier relationships, even in a crisis, so that when that crisis is over, that the network can flourish again very quickly. And I think that's what we're seeing in these data, is that global value chains were a mechanism for sort of robustness in trade, that trade relationships didn't end. They were just there was just changes in the volume, and then we saw the basis for a strong recovery. The exception is if we look at the lower graph for low-income countries. So that trend that we see at the global economy was not quite the same for low-income countries, where we saw much more of a role for the extensive margin, which meant there were more trade flows that were ceasing, that were stopping in the COVID shock than was generally observed in the global economy. And that reflects a general problem that low-income countries face, which is the survivability of their exports. That in low-income countries, it's much more difficult for firms to survive in exporting and trade than for other countries. And COVID exacerbated that problem. So there are issues that developing countries need to face with regard to resilience, and this this picture here, it covers a lot of sectors and a lot of countries, and we know that there were some sectors where developing countries were particularly adversely affected under COVID, and the apparel sector was one where we saw that firms in wealthier countries were able to cancel contracts with suppliers in countries such as Bangladesh and Cambodia without any notice, and even when the order had been produced and was waiting for shipment on the dock. And that caused huge problems for the firms in Bangladesh and Vietnam and for their employees. So there were some value chains, some global value chains, where contracts could be easily broken and were not very robust. And that reflects in some ways, the quality of relationships within a global value chain. That the more embedded, the more important a supplier is within a global value chain, the more likely it is that the lead firms will seek to persist with that relationship in a crisis, so that the network is maintained and ready for the recovery. So how can one help firms in developing countries make these stronger relationships? One way is to provide better information, so that they know the type of firms that they're signing contracts with or that they're engaging with, and they know, for example, whether those firms have a good record on corporate social responsibility, whether they have a record of supporting suppliers during a crisis. And even within the apparel sector, there were some firms which maintained their relationships with their suppliers, even though they had no demand that they could supply at that particular point in time, whereas others were ready to break those contracts. So better information about the firms that you're making matches with can be very important. And second is to assist firms to become, to move up the value chain, if you like, to become more important suppliers within the network in terms of the quality, the value of what they're adding to the network. And so again, looking at what are the factors that can enable firms in developing countries to move up the value chain to become higher quality producers is another important aspect looking forward. So that those are a couple of the challenges I think that we observed in COVID. But overall, the networks, the global value chains, appeared to be relatively resilient and paved the way for a very strong recovery during 2021 and 2022. But there are other challenges, and I'm going to pass over to Maryla now, I think, as long as I've gone through all my slides, to look at some of these other factors which are shaping the long-term future of global value chains. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you everyone for connecting to this event and for joining, and many thanks to the organizers. What I'm going to talk about is about the the four major trends that we think will impact the future of GVCs going forward. We were going to talk about increasing geopolitical risks and uncertainty, rising economic nationalism, the new technologies, and drive for sustainability. Next slide, please. When we talk about those four pre-existing trends that have been shaping GVCs and have really been accelerated by the COVID pandemic, think about the external risks, which include geopolitical, macroeconomic risks, natural disasters, and diseases like COVID. When we talk about economic nationalism, it has already been on the rise before the pandemic, but more countries, as a result of the pandemic, adopted restrictive trade and investment policies since the outbreak. Technology is the ultimate enabler and driver of GVC expansion. COVID has accelerated digitalization and technology adoption around the world across every domain. New technologies could either lengthen or shorten GVCs and alter the geographical distribution of global value chains. We also saw that firms and jobs that could be where workers could work from home were much more resilient to the shocks than jobs that could not be done from home. And that's where the role of technology comes in. Now, in terms of drive for sustainability, more and more governments and firms have announced plans to reduce carbon emissions. This will influence the future development of GVCs and require collective approaches to address externalities and share the costs and responsibilities. Next slide, please. Very briefly on what the war in Ukraine means for the world trade. On the left-hand side, you can see the most immediate impact is on food and energy trade. Russia and Ukraine are both large commodity exporters. For a key staple like wheat, their combined exports are about a quarter of global export value of wheat. The war is leading to supply shortages that are causing severe price surges, and those are clearly visible in future prices of wheat that went up at some point up to 60% since the beginning of the war, but they have come down somewhat by now, about 30% higher than a year ago. This cost is primarily paid by net importing countries, and those are low and middle income countries, most notably in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and in Middle East, Algeria, Tunisia. And this has knock-on effects on world poverty. Global and especially regional value chains are being impacted. Rising energy prices create financial problems for many firms along the supply chains, and the economic uncertainty depresses investment. And beyond these immediate consequences, in the long term, the risk of fragmented world trade system have suddenly increased. There's talk about friendshoring, reshoring, decoupling, and with it, the reversal of globalization, which has been the agent of growth and development the last 30 years, is at risk. On the right-hand side, what we're looking at is more of what that means for global supply chains. And consumers now spend more money on food and energy, while the demand for less essential, higher value-added manufacturing goods decreases. Simply, there is less income to be spent on those goods. And this trend is reflected in the restructuring of trade flows. In value terms, the share of agriculture and energy commodity in global trade increases, while the share of light manufacturing falls, leading to a decrease in integration in global value chains in light manufacturing. Next slide, please. As mentioned already just a couple of minutes ago, we've seen that more countries have adopted restrictive trade and investment policies since the outbreak of COVID-19. Some governments are also using trade and investment policies to shift production in strategic sectors. Here, the discussion of friendshoring, reshoring of production. And several high-income countries, such as developed countries, have announced measures, protectionist measures, trade and investment measures in the so-called strategic sectors. One example here comes from semiconductors, where the US, EU, China, Korea, and Japan have all been providing subsidies to shift production to their countries. Another example is healthcare, where countries have adopted screening legislation to prevent foreign acquisition or adopted export bans during the COVID pandemic, for example, on medical equipment. But stories of nearshoring may be exaggerated. For example, while China is attracting less new FDI manufacturing, investments are shifting all around the globe, not just nearby and not just to away from China. Next slide, please. So since supply chain disruptions have caused by the COVID shock prompted calls for reshoring of key manufacturing goods by advanced economies, we wanted to see what such efforts at the big scale could mean for developing countries, for the world growth, trade, and poverty reduction. In this exercise, we've used the computable equilibrium model to imagine 3 different futures. One, where the high-income countries and China encourage reshoring by subsidizing domestic production of manufacturing and services. They do it by direct subsidies, but also by putting up barriers to imports. And what you're looking at that's the blue bar in the chart, which shows the implications for income in 2030 compared to what it would have been in the absence of these policies. The alternative future is developing countries follow suit and implement also reshoring policies themselves. That's the orange bar. And finally, scenario number 3, where instead of responding in kind, the developing countries decide to become continual of the globalization efforts, lowering tariffs on intermediate inputs and cost of trade through trade facilitation reforms. Here's what we find. So reshoring would hurt growth and trade in both developed and developing countries. So everyone is worse off. While policies that support open trade could prove critical to strengthening recovery from pandemic and supporting greater diversification. So under the GVC-friendly scenario, the developing countries' trade would grow much faster, and also that would lead to a low and middle income countries would see a boost to real income growth of 10 percentage points by 2030. So the bottom line is that the reshoring leaves everyone worse off, but a more hostile environment for trade with a shift toward global reshoring could drive an additional 52 million people into extreme poverty. This is the right-hand side chart. And Sub-Saharan Africa would be hit the hardest, with 80% of the new poor being located in that region. On the other hand, measures to enhance trade could boost income, spur integration into GVCs, and leave almost 22 million people out of extreme poverty by 2030. Such measures also happen to improve relatively faster the income of the bottom 40% of the global population. Next slide, please. New technologies and their affordability are changing strategic positioning of multinational companies, and which could have implications on some rebalancing of global value chains. What you see here is the survey of multinational companies and their adoption of technology, digital technologies, and which has increased significantly. In manufacturing, almost 60% of firms reported further shifting towards more sustainable production processes, suggesting that parent companies and affiliates are taking efforts to improve, to precipitate technology adoption, and that trend is likely to continue in the years to come. And that's true across different ways of digital tools for remote working, solutions for e-commerce, supply chain management, and so on. And that's something that Paul has mentioned, the need to have the information about where your suppliers are, and the need to diversify sources of inputs, having various suppliers to strengthen resilience. Finally, the last, next slide, please. Finally, the last big trend, I think, doesn't need a lot of introduction. Climate change mitigation policies could fundamentally reshape global value chains to a far greater extent than COVID pandemic has done so. So the impact is already apparent as firms shore up vulnerabilities in production centers and governments adjust their policies to meet their NDC commitments and comply with the Paris Climate Agreement. However, new opportunities, what we see, or a likely reshaping of global value chain as a result. So the sectors that are likely to be less integrated, basically where trade will be declining, is those that are fossil fuel intensive, carbon intensive. So on the right-hand side, this is coal, gas extraction, wood, chemical products. That's of course in the absence of significant improvements in technology and big changes in demand. But as a result, there will be opportunities for developing countries in sectors that are less carbon intensive, such as wearing apparel and other light manufacturing, computers, and so on. Next slide, please. So now very briefly on the policies that will help strengthen the global value chains. And trade and investment can help drive resilient, green, and inclusive recovery. But it's important for governments to remain open to trade and investment and realign policies with shifting business realities such as digitalization, decarbonization, and some potential GVC reconfigurations as a result of geopolitical and strategic reasons. Policies also need to ensure a level playing field for all firms, safeguard market competition and contestability. And finally, in addition, global leadership and collaboration are needed to tackle the complex challenges presented by the current global environment and climate change. Overall, we conclude and provide very detailed policy recommendations in the report, but we conclude that with the right trade, investment, and environmental policies in place, and a host of complementary policies to ensure that the benefits from trade are shared widely, we believe that GVCs can continue to build resilience and drive poverty reduction in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both Paul and Maryla. There's a huge amount to react to there and a huge amount to think about. And thankfully, I'm not the one who has to react on the spot to that because we have Professor Baldwin with us today. Richard, I wonder, I know you've been thinking about global value chains for quite some time. I think it's fair to say that you've, in your own recent articles, you've positioned the reaction to COVID along a longer axis in terms of a broader trend. I wonder if you could sort of in the next 10 minutes or so, share some of your reactions to this report, as well as some of your own thinking about where some of these trends are headed.
Sure, thank you, Dimitri. I think I will share some slides. Let me just pull those up. That should work. Good, as I understand it. Okay, you guys see them. Okay, so this is the title slide. Oops, how do we get it down? There we go. So what I'd like to do, following up on Dimitri's invitation, is first of all, I'm going to agree with all the main points of the report. I've been writing about global value chains forever, and I think they are really, as they say, a key to poverty alleviations, change the way the world works, super important for development. The big puzzle is how to make global value chains work for development, to coin a phrase, and they will continue to do so forward. The only thing I would sort of stress is that I think there's a narrative in which trade was a problem during COVID, especially in the early days. People were saying, oh, they were putting on blocks on the face masks and people couldn't get their medical devices because of blockage of trade, therefore we have to make them at home. But I think what you can even see in these slides here is that the GVCs in trade in general were the heroes of the pandemic. And if it wasn't for trade in, for example, personal protective equipment, hundreds, thousands, who knows, maybe tens of thousands of frontline medical care workers would have got sick. Some of them would have died because they didn't have the proper mask and gloves and gowns and all that sort of stuff. And it was exactly the international trading system that responded very rapidly and ramped up by an order of, who knows how much, thousands of times more masks and personal protective equipment were made in a very short period of time. And that would not have been possible if there weren't global value chains. It would not have been possible if every country had to make it by themselves. So I think, at least, especially on COVID, we should sound a very loud drum that this was a victory. It wasn't kind of something to be embarrassed about, which is what the narrative was in the beginning. So the other thing is, I mean, this is a trouble when you agree with too much in the report, is what are you going to do? So one strategy for a wise discussant is to talk about the paper you would have written. So I'll do that a little bit. But also I want to say that I like the fact that, or I mean, I think it's characteristic that presumably the management of the World Bank approved the title of this report, in which it was COVID. But by the time it came out or was being finalized, there was a couple other major crises that you had to talk about that you slept into your. But it just all goes to say, with your big trend of uncertainty, is the way I like to say it is, uncertainty in global value chains and trade used to be an idiosyncratic thing, and it's shifting into systemic thing. And idiosyncratic was like a flood in Thailand or an earthquake in Japan. And now it's like all of China, every sector, every port shuts down for a while. Or all the transportation between Asia and Europe gets snarled up for a while. And systematic floods and hurricanes take ports off for months at a time. So we're really moving into a world where there's systemic, across country, across products, shocks. And we need to think about readjusting to them. So that's my sort of general comments. What I want to do is stress some facts that weren't stressed as much as I would have liked in your report, although you do mention them. And so let me go through those. So the first, and this you mentioned somewhat, is that trade in goods peaked in 2008, has been declining, and some of the global value chain stuff is part. This only goes up to 2019, but if you take it up to 2020, it's still going down. In 2021, it came up a little bit. This is on the right-hand side, world trade in goods. But on the left-hand side, we see world trade in services. And although we saw a dip in 2008, we haven't really seen that dip in, well, of course, this is before COVID, but in COVID, you saw a dip in trade, in transportation and travel, which is basically, shipping and air cargo and stuff. It's a transportation. And travel is mostly tourism. Both of those were completely clobbered, and they account for about 40% of all services. So together, services went down. But the other stuff, digitally enabled trade, which they call other commercial services, kept rising. So that's the point I want to make, is I think going forward, we need to distinguish much more carefully between services and goods. And in your report, a lot of times you talk about goods and services and aren't distinguishing them. I'll talk a little bit more about why, but some more facts. So here, if you look at other commercial services, has grown twice as fast as goods trade since 1990. And if you look at the right panel, you'll see that other commercial services now accounts for 20% of all international trade, including goods and services. So it's a big thing. And as you can see from the trend, if we extrapolate that out, it's going to grow as a share of trade. So in some sense, whereas before we sort of thought of trade as the tail, but trade in services as a tail, and trade in goods as a dog, I think it's going to start to be turning around, that trade in services is really the dynamic part, especially when it comes to development, and also global value chains in services. And just to say that global value chains is when you use international intermediate inputs into your production process of final goods. That's one way of saying it. And intermediate services are a huge input into other services, but also manufacturing. So it's going to play an increasing role in goods value chains, but also service value chains themselves is super important. Things like the business processing outsourcing is essentially a service value chain. Knowledge processing outsourcing, the call centers, all these things are basically global value chains, because they're buying intermediate inputs into a process that business is selling elsewhere. Now, this is something that didn't come out very clearly, but I think is a trend that's important. And that is that supply chains are getting shorter domestically and internationally. And there's been a tendency to focus on the international dimensions of it. And there's some indications that there's kind of withdrawing or at least regionalization of global value chains. But what I show in this, this set of data, this chart, is that the ratio of value added to gross production, which is an inverse measure of the complexity of supply chains, is now going up since 2013. This is using the OECD input-output tables calculating. It's actually one of their indicators, the ratio of value added to gross production. Now, let me explain why this is evidence of supply chains unwinding. Gross production is a production, and this, by the way, is in manufacturing. In manufacturing, you produce final goods, and you also produce goods that other manufacturers use to produce final goods. So the gross output is both final goods plus the intermediate goods. So if you look at the ratio of the value added to value added plus intermediates, when that's going down, as it did from 1995 to 2013, it means the share of production, which goes to intermediate goods, is rising, which means firms are producing more stuff than selling to each other. That's what supply chains are. If a firm makes it all themselves and doesn't sell to other firms, then the value added would be 100% of gross production. But as they're selling more goods and goods to each other, this ratio falls. Now you can see since 2013, it's been rising. And this isn't just traded. This is the entire world, all manufacturing. So, and most manufacturing is sold domestically. So this is indicating that for a variety of reasons, supply chains are getting shorter and less complex. And I think that's a key thing to look at in manufacturing. And I think one of the big reasons is the offshoring expansion phase that was so important in poverty alleviation. That's come to an end, in my view. So what you see in this very complicated thing is this is the share of world manufacturing, GDP, value added worldwide. And I'm looking at 3 different sets of countries, the G7, what we used to call the industrialized countries when they still were industrialized, the rest of the world, and what I call the A6, which are the industrialized emerging markets that really benefited from this global value chain revolution. That's China, India, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Brazil. And I chose those 6 because all of them saw their share of global manufacturing GDP go up by more than 1/2% up to 2008. Now, what you can see is the G7 share going up to about 1999 is pretty flat and very high at 2/3. And then it falls down to, say, 40%, and then flattens out again. And that's mirrored almost exactly by the gain of those 6 countries. So you see it starts going from 10% up to 35%, and then gently plateaus. The rest of the world didn't change much. So the global value chain revolution was heavily, at least in manufacturing, was heavily concentrated in a few countries. So I think it's worthwhile thinking about global value chains moving into a different phase when the increased offshoring, which was really kind of a transitional effect, is coming off the boil. Okay, and just a couple more points because I'm sure we want to take questions from the audience. First logic is service value chains versus goods value chains. Now, service trade is affected differently, usually less negatively, by the key challenges of the 21st century. And you listed 4. I think I would have put your first 2 into my second one, but it's the same list. Climate change is something that's going to change everything from global value chains to the way we live. Geoeconomic tensions, most headlined by US-China tensions, but it's going much more complex now, is going to change things a lot. And digital technology, digital transformation in general is changing things. Now, these 3 things affect trade in goods very differently than trade in services. For instance, it's hard to put protection on trade in services. It's much easier to interrupt exports of steel from China to the United States than it is the export of services from China to the United States. Although China, with its great firewall, can do that, but most countries can't do that. And climate change is the same thing. I mean, that we're going to have massive storms that knock important ports offline for long periods of time. For instance, hurricane down in New Orleans knocked the port of New Orleans offline for 18 months. So, this kind of stuff will have long living shocks. But that's not going to happen in services because it isn't so concentrated. Now, the second thing is that service trade is often more pro-women than goods trade. For a variety of reasons, women all around the world find it easier to work online than they do, even if they go into a business processing, then they will go to the factories or the farms. So that's a kind of documented thing in for instance, the ILO flagship report from last year has a whole thing on platform work, and they show it's more pro-woman. Same thing's true of digital commerce, that women entrepreneurs have an easier time getting into the world of selling exports through digitally enabled things, which has a big service component. Second, it's less energy intensive in general. It's sort of a post-industrial society. And when we start thinking about consuming less energy, services will be less severely restricted than goods. Third, it's less subject to protectionism, not because people don't want to do it, but because they can't do it. So here I'm not talking about final services in architecture and medicine and law. They have lots of protectionist devices for that. It's the intermediate services, like preparing briefs for lawyers or proofreading contracts or doing bookkeeping or screening CVs. Every business has tons and tons of service tasks which are completely unregulated, and they can outsource and increasingly do outsource them. So for example, the whole offshoring of call centers was completely unregulated. And it's an example of the intermediate services that can go forward and won't be captured by the geoeconomic things. And lastly, it's less constrained by the massive scale and agglomeration economies that characterize manufacturing. And so it will spread further. Every emerging market in the world has a bunch of people who work in offices already, who do bookkeeping and accounting and background legal research. And those people can just get online and start selling. So I think from a development perspective, service value chains will be very, very important going forward. Okay, just to repeat that point, services, global value chains, trade and intermediate services is something we all need to learn a lot more about. Just a fun fact, for example, intermediate services are 3 times more important in the economies of major economies than intermediates in goods. So we know a lot, we have a lot of data, but intermediate services are much more important. And if you go, intermediate services are hard to measure, but in the international input-output tables like TIVA, they're already in there. Somebody has calculated what's an intermediate service and what's the final services. So you do have data on it. Second, the global value chain may continue to spread geographically via services. So up till now, and Paul mentioned it in passing, a lot of this miracle has been around Japan to start with, and the Japan-Korea, and now Japan-Korea-China. The global value chain revolution is happening in a narrow geographic area around that. And in Europe, it's between Western Europe and Central Europe. In the United States, it's between North America and Latin America. So third is service-led development may be more important than industry-led development going forward, and service value chains will be a big part of that. So just think India, not China. And those are the sort of takeaways I want. So anyways, I love the report. It's really a good summary and update of what's going on. I heartily recommend it to anybody who's teaching about global value chains or wants to know about global value chains, because although there's some great reports out there, they're a little bit outdated, and this one's bang up to date, which I really, really like. But since I liked it so much, I had to discuss about something else, and I hope you'll excuse the fact that I mostly talked about stuff that I wish was also in the report instead of what was in the report. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richard. We have a little bit of time left, and if the Q&A starts flowing thick and fast, we can certainly extend for a little while longer. And to run that, I wonder if I could pass it over to you, Dr. Ferrantino, if you have questions of your own, or if you'd like to look at questions that, once again, people can throw into Q&A. There's been 2 long presentations to react to here. So please, the floor is yours, sir.
Right. So we're we are monitoring the chat for questions, and I'd like to let the audience know, if you haven't noticed, that there are links both to the main report that we are presenting and to the additional report about the trade effects of the Ukraine-Russia crisis in the chat. I think I'd like to turn to Richard and ask something about services trade and its impact on development. So one of the sort of tools of resiliency in COVID was the ability of people to work at home with the type of technology that we're using in this presentation today. But we did a number of interviews of firms and government offices in developing countries. And what we found was that in many places, the 2020 in a place like Kenya or Malaysia was like 2002 in the OECD, which is to say that they were having their very first experiences with telework, and that might have been, some of the more best practice organizations, and their experience was very similar to what ours was in the North in 2002. In the first place, not everybody had technology. In the second place, there were principal agent problems and concerns about whether the person at home was working at all, okay? And so, there were a lot of trust issues. And so I'm wondering, since these services, don't diffuse equally everywhere, what sort of approaches that we can take to make them work more efficiently in a developing country context.
Sure. Thank you for that question, Michael, and I'll answer it very quickly. First of all, the UNCTAD is a whole initiative to encourage what they call digitally enabled trade, which is partly e-commerce, but a lot of it's services. And they have a whole list of things to do, which they're the experts, not me. The other is the analogy of the kind of work from home things that we all ended up doing is not as apt as one might think for developing countries. And what I had more in mind was the business processing outsourcing sector in the emerging markets, which has been a big thing in a number of, like the Philippines and India and Costa Rica. So it's that more or less commercially oriented export of services rather than every office sending their people home and letting them commute, telecommute. And it is, I mean, there's no surprise here. The connectivity, the fact that not everybody has a laptop at home, not everybody has Wi-Fi at home, made it much harder. Also, the fact that since they're much younger, they didn't lock down as hard, many, or didn't have the money to do it, so the lockdowns weren't as severe. But in any case, what I like when I think about going to policy and what should you do, there's now a fairly growing industry of how to get developing countries into the business processing outsourcing sector. So A.T. Kearney has a BPO competitiveness index, for instance, and a number of countries are trying to attract BPO centers. Like I was working on Colombia, and Bogota is now kind of a thriving center on business processing outsourcing, mostly in Spanish. But that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. And that I don't know where else to say it, but I mean, I understand your skepticism about it's not the same in the developing world, but there is rapid growth of other commercial services and other business services from the developing country, and it's not just India. So that's what I would point to. I'll stop there.
I mean, I get about the BPOs, but like the problems we were facing were people with traditional services. I am trying to run a port or a social security office suddenly from home when this has never been done before. Paul, you mentioned the sort of fragility of some of the global value chains at the bottom, the cancellation of contracts in low-income countries in apparel and so on. I was wondering if you could say something about the fragility at the top, how many multinationals we found that simply weren't able to see their value chains, and for example, had no idea whether or not they had a tier 1 supplier in Wuhan, let alone a tier 2 supplier.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, indeed. I mean, it was apparent that some of these major firms were very much in the dark about where some of their critical inputs were coming from. So this has led to, I think, some sort of reappraising of priorities and the need for more information on their value chains to identify, where vulnerabilities lie. What the report also shows is, that trade, offers opportunities for diversification to reduce risks, so that if you are aware that there are particular suppliers or particular nodes that you are dependent on, it's trade that offers the opportunities to diversify and source from other suppliers as well. So I think we are seeing much more emphasis now on understanding value chains and where these critical nodes are. While I've got the microphone, I'd just like to reply to Richard's comments, which I agree with all of them. I think they're very, very, very useful. But I think a couple of things from my point, when we're thinking about how trade continues to drive poverty reduction, and if trade is becoming much more, if GVCs are becoming much more services oriented. The first one is on data, and I think of Africa, and there's a real data deficit on trade and services. We really don't know what African countries are trading in services amongst themselves. So I think this is a little bit of a cry for help, that we need much more effort on getting better data on trade and services, so that we can understand much better how services are changing trade opportunities. And I think this is something that's real, because I look at a country like Kenya, which is fairly sophisticated in the way that it's adopted some of the services technologies. We think of M-Pesa. Kenya was one of the first countries in the world that allowed for payment via cell phones, smartphones. And there is quite a sophisticated services sector in Kenya. And I'm sure it is providing services across borders to other countries in the region, but we don't know what they are. So I think first one that's on services is the data, and we need to invest in that. The second is on physical investments. And I'm thinking here about a little bit that the aid for trade, where we work for agencies that want to support developing countries to integrate into the global economy. But what should the priorities be? And I think what Richard's saying is that we need to look pretty carefully, that we need to reappraise our priorities. At the moment, we're putting a lot of emphasis on ports, on road infrastructure, but should we be tweaking that a little bit more now to digital infrastructure, the climate resilience of electricity grids, etc. So I think that's something as our institution we need to think very carefully about. That if this shift to services and services GVCs is real, what does that mean for the investments that we're supporting in our client countries? Thanks.
You're muted, Dr. Ferrantino.
I'm sorry. Yeah, if we just have time to direct one to Maryla, you reported to us the good news that the increase in global wheat prices has moderated, and we're all looking at the situation in Ukraine, which has both a logistical aspect and a production aspect. And on the logistical aspect, there has been some amelioration since July, when the port of Odessa was reopened. But on the production side, it remains the case that most of the wheat production in Ukraine is in the southern and eastern parts of the country, where A, the conflict has been, and B, there has been depopulation because of the displacement of 12 million people, mostly from those regions in Ukraine. And so in light of how the conflict there is progressing, what do you think are the prospects of a moderation in global food price inflation, and what will it take for things to get better?
That's a really tough question. And I think on top of the fact that, yes, the displacement of people and the ongoing war, I think, and the logistical issues, I think there's the World Bank is supporting Ukraine in many ways, trying to find new transport routes, and at least where harvest is where the wheat is still being able to be grown safely and being transported through Poland and other routes. But also, I think in the long run, well, even if the war was to be over like tomorrow, which I'm sure we're all are praying for, that there's mines in those fields, and it will take years really to clear it, and maybe months, but and a huge effort. And I know that the World Bank is very much involved in planning how to help Ukraine recover after the war, but we're not there yet. So I'm afraid that the situation will likely to continue, and the inflation is there to stay. I know that other countries are picking up the slack and producing more to the extent it's possible. But another channel that has negative impacts is the prices of fertilizer that have gone up, and in countries that are producing wheat, the yields will be lower because the farmers won't be able to afford as much or the quality of fertilizer they would like to. So I'm afraid it's something that's going to take a while to resolve. I know that Paul asked Richard a couple of questions, so I don't want to add to it, but I was also really curious to hear your take, Professor Baldwin, of how should we, as the World Bank, tailor our advice specifically for Africa. So your presentation has really made me think of this whole discussion of the structural change in Africa and how Africa can perhaps leapfrog manufacturing and jump straight into services, which, well, that would be a huge challenge. But is this something that, going back to that discussion, on one hand, we have rising wages in China, so there's scope for a lot of countries to pick up some of this production that maybe will become too expensive, the labor intensive for manufacturing. But then if you think really the future is in services, should our policy advise to those countries in Africa specifically? I work a lot on the region, so I'm really curious on your take how our policy advice perhaps should change in the light of what you think is the future of GVCs. Thanks a lot.
Well, I'm just a professor, so I can say whatever I want. I'll tell you my opinion, and that is I don't think there's really any hope for manufacturing-led development in most parts of Africa, apart from Northern Africa that might get involved in the European value chains, or Southern Africa, which might get involved in some of the South African value chains. There are, of course, commodity value chains as well, like in tea and coffee and some higher end things. So there's that. But services is much easier, and I believe that's the sort of way to go forward. Now, a little while ago, I discussed another World Bank report called In Your Service, in which they looked at the development-led aspects of services, and the IMF has done some. So there's a number of people who are real experts who sort of looked into this. But my basic take is that the global value chain revolution has been extremely concentrated in a handful of countries, partly because of the reinforced role of distance and time in the back and forth, and the enormous agglomeration. So, China is no longer the cheapest in many things, but because they can make so much so fast, and people go to China. And so it's become, an agglomeration advantage, not just a cost advantage. I think it's going to be extremely difficult for Africa to get over that sort of thing. So that's what I would say. So if you look at In Your Service report about service-led development, I think that would suggest that a change towards something that's more, that's less huge to get, it's less chunky, it's less difficult, the agglomerations are less important, and it takes actually less government coordination than it did before. So if you remember, India did its miracle in service exports without a single trade agreement. And at least in the beginning, the government wasn't even supporting it in any way. It was just basically that the arbitrage was so huge that it got done. And so that's the sort of way I was doing it. The international, just continuing on this, the IADB had done some projects teaching people how to get online, the freelance platforms. And this is super, micro firm, one-person firms, or even part-time person firms. And they learn how to get onto the platform and earn a few dollars an hour. That matters in a country even like Colombia, for example. $5 an hour is not a bad salary in Colombia. So there's those elements. And personally, I think the future of development is going to be services, in part because manufacturing is becoming automated, which is taking the jobs out of services. There's an interesting data set on jobs in services, and China is losing a ton of jobs in services. Of course, not all the rich countries, sort of stabilize in the rich countries, but China is losing a lot of manufacturing jobs, I should say. And they're not many of them are going to Africa. And I'm afraid that, for example, once textile and apparel production gets automated, which people say it will eventually, then that really takes out the whole bottom of the light manufacturing first rung on the ladder. So sorry to be so pessimistic, but I think it's worthwhile at least encouraging services. It also, I think, has a better distributional consequences, because manufacturing in any country is involving large firms, big investments, tend to be male-dominated workforces, tends to be relatively high paid, but relatively few jobs, whereas services is much more democratic, if you will, flat.
If I could just add to this, I think getting firms involved in GVCs or even in exporting is not just a matter of technology, but about organizational knowledge. So one of the things that some governments and some development agencies, like the USAID trade hubs in Africa, spend a lot of time in is what they call qualified exporter programs. So the internet is growing rapidly. You can be sitting somewhere in a rubber factory in Africa and have no problem watching YouTube. But yeah, it's what you actually need to be a qualified exporter is to know how to handle things like bills of lading, relationships with freight forwarders, customs procedures, maybe letters of credit. And those capabilities are not uniformly distributed among firms. And if you never learned the dead tree version of those, then simply giving you online access to something doesn't necessarily complete the process of your being able to join value chains.
Dr. Ferrantino, I wonder if we could wrap up Q&A with this last question we've received from a listener that's in Q&A, and then we might end the session, because I feel like there's so much to explore here. We could keep you all here for hours, but we did ask for a fixed amount of your time, and I'm worried we're straining your generosity. But I do want to, if you care to do it, if you could stitch up the question from Morbit in Q&A, and then we might end the session. I think you might be
sorry.
muted,
So this is just coming from the audience, and I think this one is for Maryla. You stressed the expected strong impact of climate-related issues and policy for the future development of GVCs. Are you talking about policy changes like carbon border adjustment measures, or changes in operating and transport conditions like actual changes in weather patterns, or about something else? Could you elaborate?
Thank you so much, Mombert, for the question. And all of those factors are likely to affect global value chains. You're absolutely right. But when talking specifically about the simulations that we've conducted for this report, we've been focusing on climate mitigation. So not just carbon adjustment measures, which are important, but mostly focusing on countries' NDC commitments, because those will have profound effects for comparative advantage and for changing trade patterns. And CBAM adds a bit on top of it, but for most countries, what we found is that that really the NDCs of your own NDCs and other countries' climate mitigation goals are going to reshape the trade flows quite significantly. So that's something that we're working on currently. We've Paul and Vicky Chemtai have released a report on trade and climate change nexus. Paul is ready. And now there is a second report coming up where we specifically look at how climate change mitigation policies are going to reshape global value chains and comparative advantage, and what are going to be the distributional effects of those changes. And I'm sure Paul will love to tell you more about methane and just not focusing on carbon emission, but looking also at other greenhouse gases. But I think we're out of time, but yeah, watch this space for more, I would say.
If I may, if we've got a few seconds, just to follow up on that, is that I think in addition to public schemes such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU, lead companies within global value chains are also putting a lot of pressure on their suppliers with regard to reducing emissions. So, you know, the famous one here is Walmart, which has a project Gigaton, which is trying to reduce by a gigaton the emissions from its suppliers. And Walmart's emissions are all from its suppliers. Its own emissions are actually very limited. So there's going to be increasing pressure within value chains for suppliers to reduce to first measure and to reduce their emissions, so that the capacity to measure and verify carbon emissions is going to become much more important for suppliers in global value chains. And that requires investments, particularly in the least developed countries where those capacities are very limited. But in addition to these public schemes, we're going to see a lot of pressure within, or we are seeing a lot of pressure within global value chains to shift to low carbon and to decarbonize. Thanks.
That might be a great place to finish off. Thank you so much to Dr. Maliszewska, Dr. Ferrantino, Professor Baldwin, and of course, Paul Brenton for a really enlightening discussion that covered a huge amount of ground in far too short a time. I think as the persistence of the audience shows, people could listen to you all explore these issues for a very long time indeed. But if they would like to read you exploring these issues in text-based format, they are very encouraged to download the book, Reshaping Global Value Chains in Light of COVID-19, Implications for Trade and Poverty Reduction in Developing Countries. We have put the link in the chat. We will, of course, put the links in the YouTube video and on our website. And we do really encourage people check it out, as there is a lot of data there that should be shaping how we think about all of these issues and how both governments and international organizations respond to try to help developing countries position themselves to take advantage of some of these trends. So with that, let me thank everyone again and thank our viewers and wish you all a lovely evening.